Hi everyone, my name's Anika, and I wrote about Shirley Jackson's novel Hangsaman and fractured female identity in the Gothic. I was advised by the wonderful Professor Marie McDonough, and my final deliverable was a magazine article that I'm currently working on getting published, but there's a QR code to a preprint version if you're interested. I'll also share the link again at the end of the presentation. But to start out, I'll define a few key terms. So first, Gothic refers to more of a mode of writing than any specific genre classification. It usually includes motifs like old haunted houses, supernatural occurrences, and some taboo subjects as well, such as incest. The female Gothic specifically often includes these motifs in the context of gender depression. And Bildungsroman is a coming-of-age narrative where the protagonist grows in some way from the beginning to the end of the story. And lastly, in this presentation, I'll use the term surrealist to refer to a disjointed, abstract method of storytelling where the line between fact and fiction isn't always clear. And one last note that this presentation does deal with themes of sexual assault. So the guiding question in writing my article was, what does the protagonist Natalie's journey in Hangsaman teach us about the Gothic and Bildungsroman genres? First, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the author, Shirley Jackson. So the most famous of her works are the short story The Lottery and the novel The Haunting of Hill House. And she was also the mother of 4 children and the wife to the literary critic Stanley Hyman. Jackson struggled a lot with domestic life, though, because she was never seen as an intellectual equal to her husband. Hyman expected Jackson to do all the housework and child rearing while also being okay with him openly cheating on her. He's also quoted as saying some questionable things, like that he didn't believe women could be raped because ultimately their excitement made them receptive. So just to give you an idea, that was the context in which Jackson was living and writing. The novel Hangsaman has some clear parallels to Jackson's life. It follows 17-year-old Natalie Waite as she tries to form her own identity in college. She looks up to her father, an egotistical writer who openly cheats on his wife, Natalie's mother. When she reaches college, Natalie becomes infatuated with a professor who reminds her of her father and looks down on all the other women who fawn over him. And Natalie resents the fact that her mother is very emotionally volatile. Even though her father is the one treating her mother badly, she wants to associate more closely with him because she thinks that this will help her avoid the outcome in life that her mother has reached. The inciting incident of the book is when it occurs before Natalie leaves home at a garden party thrown for her father and his literary colleagues. She is led into the woods and assaulted by an older man to whom her father has introduced her. Understandably, she deals with post-traumatic stress in the aftermath and tries to forget the whole encounter once she goes off to college. To cope, she leans into her habits of hyper-intellectualism, hyper-independence, and dissociation. So this novel is partially inspired by the Hanged Man tarot card. Jackson started studying tarot and the occult while she was at college, and it always continued to be a really big inspiration for her. The Hanged Man tarot card represents a spiritual journey, a new beginning for the soul. Natalie feels like her going off to college is like a killing of her old self, and that she'll reinvent herself in her new environment through her social and intellectual pursuits. The sinister underlayer of all of this, though, is that Natalie's father is really benefiting from her desire to be more like him. It fuels his own narcissism, and he views her potentially forming her own identity at college as a threat to himself. So in one letter that Mr. Waite writes to Natalie while she's at college, he says, "It's always been my opinion, that princesses are confined in towers only because they choose to stay confined, and the only dragon required to keep them there was their own desire to be kept." So he wants her to believe about herself what she's always believed about her mother, that the reasons for her subjugation begin and end within herself. But to acknowledge that her father is manipulating her would shatter Natalie's whole foundation of her worldview, and this is why her concept of self begins to fracture after this point in the novel. So more than halfway through the book, Natalie writes to her father about a girl named Tony who she supposedly made friends with at college. It's widely believed among readers, though, that Tony is not a real person. She's the only woman in the entire novel that Natalie seems to respect, and she has these qualities that Natalie herself doesn't have, like being provocative and fearless. If you know anything about tarot cards, you know that the cards have different meanings when they're pulled upside down. The reversed Hanged Man represents a reversal in attitude or perception, a loss of position, or going through an ordeal willingly. If Natalie is the hanged man trying to embark on a new journey, Tony represents a splitting off of Natalie's self, not being afraid of the world anymore, but rather going about it in a way that pleases her. At the climax of the novel, Natalie and Tony run away from the college together, but Natalie's spooked when Tony leads her into the woods and, as Natalie believes, makes a move on her. This is a very clear callback to Natalie's initial trauma at the garden party that she clearly still hasn't processed. So at this point, I want to share with you a stanza of an old folk song that's quoted in the epigraph of the novel. It's from a ballad called The Maid Freed from the Gallows, about a girl who is set to be publicly hung. In the first 3 stanzas, the girl calls out to her father, mother, and brother for help. They do not respond to her, though, and so she realizes that they will be complicit in her execution. They've simply come along with everybody else to watch her be hung. The stanza that's quoted in the epigraph reads, "Slack your rope, Hangsaman, oh slack it for a while. I think I see my true love coming, coming many a mile." And I think it's interesting that Jackson chose to quote only this last stanza about the true love. And instead of seeing this as a literal true love who's come to save the girl, I read it more as an imaginary figure that the girl has invented in her last hour of desperation. Realizing that no one can really save her, she just cannot bear to feel alone in her last moments. And as you can see in my annotation, the following lines in the ballad are, "True love, have you brought me hope, or have you paid my fee, or have you come to see me hanging?" So I also think it's interesting that Jackson left that out. This public execution is symbolic of the vulnerability associated with being a young girl. This quote is from the very, very beginning of the book, from Natalie saying, "I may be in danger every moment of my life, but I'm strong within myself." Jackson presents the figure of the teenage girl as the ultimate Gothic hero, socially transgressive and thus ostracized. But in order to fully understand how Natalie's taken advantage of, we have to understand some of the social forces at play. So in particular, I actually opened my essay with this quote from Bonnie Burstow's Radical Feminist Therapy. "As the daughter gets older, she is more often lumped with the mother to whom she feels superior. Intermittently, she feels furious with the father for going along with the unfair status change, and she blames the mother for passing on the curse of womanhood." And this is a quote from Natalie's mother to Natalie at the garden party, shortly before Natalie ends up being assaulted. She says, "All these years, your father has been trying to get rid of me, and you watch out. The minute you start getting too big, he'll be after you too." After this, Natalie is described as feeling agonizing embarrassment about her mother's warnings, just one example of how she buys into her father's worldview at the expense of her mother and ultimately at her own expense. So at the end of the novel, Natalie returns to college without the company of Tony, and the last line of the book says that she was now alone and grown up and powerful and not at all afraid. But the reader, or at least this reader, is not so easily convinced. Has Natalie's place in the world really changed, or is she simply returning to what's familiar, hoping that the social pressures that drove her away the first time will not get the better of her now? Hangsaman represents the elusive, ambiguous promises of girlhood in American society, and by the end of the novel, we're wondering if Natalie has simply retraced her steps back to where she began, ready for another false start. To me, Hangsaman really reads as an indictment of the social power structures and that enable young women to be taken advantage of, and this inspired many future authors to come. So here's a link to my article if you would like to read it in full. Thank you so much for your time, and a special thanks to my advisor, Professor McDonough.
How did you decide to focus on this novel?
Yeah, it was definitely, so I read The Haunting of Hill House first, and that was the first thing of Jackson's I'd ever read. And then I just started going through her novels, but I think this one was particularly interesting because of just how weird it was. The Hill House is really famous, and they all have easy to follow plots, but I think this one, I was just so intrigued by how it was interpreted so differently over time. The original reviews from the 50s when it came out interpreted Tony as a real character, and they wrote about it that way because most of the reviewers were men, and they just didn't understand the novel. And so I thought it would be a really cool one to go back and look at.
I was actually wondering a little bit about that idea. You mentioned that it's widely believed that Tony is a figment of Natalie's imagination. Is that just understood through fans of Shirley Jackson's work?
So it's kind of a couple of things. So her biographer, her primary biographer, Ruth Franklin, writes in the biography, like as if it's pretty much like a fact that Tony is false. I wouldn't necessarily go that far. Like I think readers, there's still some debate among like just general readers. But I think like in the academic works, it's pretty much like widely said that she's fake. But since it's a novel, I think it's still good to kind of keep some ambiguity out there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this. You did an amazing job at the beginning of articulating the power of the Gothic when interpreted through the feminist imagination. And I'm wondering if you think there is a contemporary genre that has taken over that power.
I think the Gothic mode is still very much being used. I think like maybe almost like science fiction. Like I know the book Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, that actually won the Shirley Jackson Award. And like a lot of Carmen Marie Machado's work is sort of doing the same thing now. And those are still classified as Gothic, but they're also more like contemporary and like set in like eco horror type of settings. And I think that's like really taken over a lot as well. But I think it's sort of like a continuation of these same ideas.
Hi, I thought you did a really amazing job, and I just had a few questions because I feel like you mentioned reviews about the time, and I was wondering if there was any like lashback, because most people were male critics, about it being like they were very against it, because I feel like it really takes a more modern feminist perspective. So I was wondering if there's anybody who's like didn't like this change and would rather, or was very against it because like at the beginning she really held like the social parameters of the time by respecting the father more than the mother. So I was just curious about the critics at the time.
Yeah, so it didn't have much of a backlash, but I think it was because they didn't really credit Jackson with like having a message in her book. Like even her husband, whom the father character is based on, which is like a very critical, like the biographer says that this book is a open letter of hatred to Jackson's husband. So like, even though it was that strong, like the husband, actually Stanley Hyman, read the book, was like, wow, it's great. And like, but he also is quoted as saying like, she doesn't even understand like what she's writing. Like she's a genius, but she doesn't understand her own like genius, which is crazy. And so it was more like, there wasn't a big reaction against it because men more so just like belittled her and was like, she doesn't even like understand what she wrote. And so this is just like a weird piece of psychological fiction, but there's no like, they didn't like think there was an impact at all. And there honestly kind of wasn't. The sales like weren't that good when it was first released.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, great presentation. This is a really random question, but I noticed you used a photo from Vermont on some of your slides. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so Jackson and her husband lived in North Bennington, Vermont. I believe Hyman taught at Bennington College, and it's actually like, so it might be a myth, but some people think that this book, Hangsaman, is loosely based on the disappearance of a college student at Bennington College while he was teaching there. But yeah, they lived in like a really small town, but she was originally from California. And so a lot of her like memoirs and stuff and her letters sort of deal with that idea too of feeling very closely watched and feeling sort of like out of her element. And that's why I wanted to include some of the like suburban scene to sort of like set that mood as well. But yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll have a 2-minute transition period.